So the truth is that advertising dollars represent a far smaller share of the revenue of the Daily Wire than they did at the very beginning. When you're first starting a company, the possibility of starting it off the basis of subscribers alone is very difficult because you actually don't have tremendous market reach. The gradual increase in revenue is largely due to advertiser revenue. So at the beginning of the Daily Wire, nearly 100% of all revenue that we had when we were building the business was based on advertising revenue. Today, it's significantly smaller than that because we have a very large subscriber base. So the principal threat that I'm here to talk about is not about the bitterness of my company, which continues to be, thank God, highly successful. The reason that I'm here is to talk about startup companies that are attempting to get into the market and are being barred from an extraordinarily large pool of advertising revenue along political lines.
Shapiro started by giving a little background on how his company, the Daily Wire, generates revenue. In the early days, the majority of their income came from advertising. That's not surprising. Advertising is often the lifeline for new media ventures. He stated he's not there to complain about how his business is doing. In fact, he states it's highly successful. What he's concerned about is the ability of newer conservative or alternative media startups to even get off the ground, especially when they're cut off from mainstream advertising dollars for what he claims are political reasons.
Do you believe there is collective boycotts that are happening?
There's no question there are collective boycotts happening. And I will say that I do appreciate the chutzpah of some of the Democratic members of Congress, and I'm charmed by their newfound love for free markets and corporate free speech. That one seems to be a bit of a new one to me. But it is charming only in that it requires you to ignore many of the statements that they have made historically about the amount of pressure they would love to bring on private companies when it comes to free speech. And here I will quote the ranking member, quote, "These platforms are utilized as conduits to spread vitriolic hate messages into every home and country. Efforts by media companies to counter this surge have fallen short. Social network platforms continue to be used as ready avenues to spread dangerous white nationalist speech." Or, that was from 2019, from 2020, it goes way beyond the fact that big tech misbehaves. It's the fact this kind of power exists. That kind of power cannot be allowed to exist in society. When you use that sort of language with regard to the same companies we're now hearing require free speech, I find that somewhat difficult to swallow.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Shapiro argues that there are what he calls collective boycotts happening in the advertising world. Essentially, he says that certain organizations, including ones backed or supported by government officials, are influencing companies to avoid placing ads on content deemed too politically controversial, especially content from right-of-center media.
But I do think Mr. Shapiro is absolutely correct that if this government is in any way acting to pressure or nudge companies to censor speech or to corrupt their business decisions for political ends, we ought to vigorously act to stop that. But if they're just doing that to themselves, that's their right to make stupid decisions, and government also exists to protect that right. Mr. Shapiro, I'll give you the last word.
I mean, I agree with much of what you're saying. I think that the big concern for the Daily Wire and companies like ours is the nexus between government action and groups like GARM. And it appears clear to us that a well-meaning organization that simply wanted to appeal to the broadest possible audience would not be making political decisions about which outlets are too right or which outlets are too left. I'm perfectly fine with advertisers advertising on Pod Save America or on MSNBC. The problem that we have is an informal structure by which members of government, including this White House, have pressured social media companies in order to restrict their content. And everyone can see that. There's a lot of, will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest going on from members of the government who then seem to be shocked when there's pushback from the right on exactly the same sort of matter.
One of the major concerns Shapiro raises is the use of vague or subjective standards when it comes to determining what kind of content advertisers should support. He calls these pseudo-objective standards, standards that may look neutral on the surface, but in practice tend to lean heavily in one political direction. That, he argues, leads to a kind of systemic bias.
Foreign influence from London, for example, is malign.
Again, I think that one of the big problems here that we have is vague, unspecified, subjective standards that are posing as pseudo-objective standards. And under that guise, all bias falls in one direction. When all the bias keeps falling in one direction, you start to suspect that actually the standard is not objective. And once again, the standards that are being used by GARM are, as stated by the titular head of GARM, not aligned with the First Amendment. This is a person who has overtly criticized, according to the report. The First Amendment itself talked about how those standards should not apply. So why wouldn't he apply his own standards or the standards of a political side of the aisle to advertising dollars if they could? I mean, the use, again, of advertising dollars as a cudgel in order to shut down one political side of the aisle, the effects of that are quite clear, certainly on a wide variety of businesses on the right.
One of the more thought-provoking parts of Shapiro's testimony deals with what he calls the nexus between government and private actors. Basically, he's talking about informal pressure, where government officials don't outright force companies to remove or demonetize content, but they strongly suggest it. He refers to this kind of soft influence as a "no one rid me of this meddlesome priest" dynamic, a historical phrase that hints at indirect orders with clear consequences. In his view, this kind of pressure blurs the line between government censorship and private decision-making. And even if it's technically legal, it raises red flags about fairness, transparency, and constitutional rights.
So is it then, whether or not antitrust law as it currently exists extends to that, if foreign governments or foreign-based political actors with global reach are using their economic power to limit the expressive rights of Americans, or certainly to intrude on and affect our electoral processes by favoring one political side or the other, to the point of, jumping and saying we don't like the Hunter Biden laptop being exposed, is that not a legitimate object for Congress certainly to look at? And then should Congress consider the extent of its regulatory power to protect Americans' expressive rights?
I mean, it's certainly quite dangerous when you have the EU working with GARM to set standards for what companies can and cannot advertise or should not advertise, while simultaneously attempting to regulate the social media companies that are largely the recipients of those ad dollars.
What accounts for the solicitude of my colleagues, the Democrats, for the international conglomerates' expressive rights and their disregard for the expressive rights of ordinary Americans?
Yeah, I mean, the hypocrisy is rather glaring. As I said earlier, the shocking adherence to free market capitalism and freedom of consumer choice on the left side of the aisle today is something to behold. They've invoked it almost as commonly as they've invoked Project 2025 today, which, frankly, I'm getting a little creeped out by. I think if they say it 3 times, then President Trump appears and challenges them to a golf match or something. It's like Beetlejuice.
It would be funny if it weren't so strange. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back.
He points out that some of the same politicians who once criticized big tech and media platforms for hosting so-called dangerous speech are now suddenly defending those platforms when it comes to matters of corporate free speech. Later in his remarks, Shapiro brings up the influence of foreign governments and multinational organizations. He warns that international bodies, particularly in Europe, are working with ad organizations like GARM to set global advertising standards. The issue he sees is that these foreign standards may influence American companies and ultimately American speech. He asks whether Congress should look into whether foreign-based political actors are trying to manipulate advertising to favor one political outcome over another. It's a fair question, especially in an era when digital advertising is global and boundaryless. This also raises the point about whether the U.S. government should step in to protect what he refers to as Americans' expressive rights, even in cases where the actors involved aren't based in the United States. One of the themes that comes up again and again in Shapiro's testimony is balance. He says he has no issue with advertisers choosing to support progressive shows like Pod Save America or networks like MSNBC. What he wants is a level playing field, where companies like the Daily Wire can also participate in the advertising economy without facing political exclusion. He's not asking for special treatment. He's asking why political affiliation should determine whether a company can make a living through ads. If companies are being influenced, either directly or indirectly, to avoid conservative media purely for ideological reasons, then that affects not just the businesses, but also the range of perspectives the public gets to see and hear. Ben Shapiro's testimony raises questions about where private decisions end and government influence begins. It brings up concerns about vague standards, international pressure, and the growing difficulty for politically non-mainstream outlets to compete on equal footing, especially in the world of digital advertising. Even if you disagree with his politics, the core issues here, free expression, fairness in business, and the influence of both domestic and foreign actors on American media, deserve serious attention. In the age of algorithms and ad tech, it's not just about who gets to speak, it's about who gets heard, who gets funded, and who gets silenced without ever being told why. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe companies like the Daily Wire are being unfairly targeted? Or do you think advertisers have every right to pick and choose based on their brand image? If you found this breakdown helpful, consider giving it a like and subscribing for more deep dives into the intersection of media, politics, and technology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.